African leaders were not consulted prior to the US Africa Leaders Summit about what the agenda would be, what some of the outcomes should be. So there is this underlying, even though you will see African heads of state smiling and nodding and taking photos and whatnot, there is on the sidelines, I think, this perception that Africa is still treated as a junior partner in the international political landscape. I think this is important to understand in the US Africa summit that just happened, is in August, we had Antony Blinken, the US Secretary of State, launching the new strategy document, the US strategy towards sub-Saharan Africa. And in it, they mention China and Russia combined at least 10 times. And they talk about them in terms of their near-peer rivalry, and there's very little mention of what does the African sovereignty project look like? What would it look like for us to independently engage the African continent to ensure that we can help them on their own terms, on our own terms, uplift the African continent? So we see this discrepancy around, you say that you want to talk to us on our own terms, you say we shouldn't choose, you say this is just about the US and Africa forming a stronger relationship, but clearly it's all premised on a kind of great power competition and geopolitical competition, a new Cold War, essentially.
My next guest, Mikaela Erskog, a South Africa-based researcher. She's the editor and researcher with Tricontinental Institute for Social Research. She's also a member of the Pan Africanism Today secretariat and also part of the coordinating committee of the No Cold War, this international peace platform. So Mika, welcome to the show.
Greetings. Very nice to be here. I'm super honored to be, I think, the only one who hasn't been on the show previously. So thank you very much for having me.
But you know what? I always wanted to reach out to you, to invite you to share your views, because I know you had this show, the Korean Africa-China podcast. Did I get the name correct?
Perfectly, yes. Through the Dongsheng Collective, the Dongsheng News Collective, which Tings is a senior editor in, we decided to create a podcast on Africa-China relationships because, as you know, and as you've mentioned, there are so many people in the West world who are speaking on behalf of Africa. And when they are Africans speaking about the African situation, it's often people who, are in NGOs, are well-paid government officials, or are experts who are historically aligned with a Eurocentric view of the world. So for us, it was super important. Myself and my co-host, Amadeus Musimali, who's a Zambian-based researcher, we decided we have to talk about this China-Africa thing from a perspective of young African people who are politically interested in the advancement of our continent.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned something very important because, several media or Western governments, they love talking about Africa. They always talking about Africa and China-Africa relations, but rarely they talk to local Africans. How do they see, what's their worldview? How do they see the relations between China and Africa? So, and also now one of the most popular narrative they want to use is like, you know what, through the BRI, the Belt and Road Initiative, China is buying up the whole African continent. So, I mean, what's your view on this, cooperation between China and African nations?
Sure. So, I mean, it's not without its areas of concern or aspects that we need to build up. We must keep in mind that, we have a continent of over 1.4 billion people, similar, I guess, to the size of the Chinese population, but we've been historically underdeveloped, so we are lacking education, lacking access to basic, material services. I think it's more than half of the African continent doesn't have access to water, doesn't have access to electricity. And so I will say that amongst the average African people, there is a bit of I think a lack of sense of what the China-Africa relationship means in the bigger picture of what Africa's development means. Because historically, we've been pitted against foreigners. I'm based in South Africa, although right now I'm in Mozambique. But historically, South Africa, for example, has always been very xenophobic, not only to other African countries and other African nationals, but of course to anyone who comes outside of the continent who isn't Western or European, because of course, ironically, due to the processes of colonization, we came to accept white Western interference or intervention or collaboration, although I wouldn't call it collaboration. And it created suspicion against other Africans or other nationals who are coming from the global south who might have an agenda that might actually serve our people. But so my point one is to say that the average African person has been so historically underdeveloped that there is a mixture of views around what the Africa-China relationship is. But as we've seen in recent studies and polls, whether it's Gallup or the Afrobarometer, I think it's 77% of youth in Africa see their future as being tied to the Chinese people and the Chinese economic and political project. So I think more and more in the recent years, people have been looking at China more favorably because of the very clear material developments that China has offered in the last 2 decades. I mean, in the last 2 decades, China has come to the African continent and offered up, of course, cheaper loans with longer maturing periods, infrastructural development. We've seen developments across, multi-dimension of spectrums, whether it's tech, whether it's medicine, whether it's education, whether it's telephones, coming up with cheaper phones like the techno phones that also have certain features that are more favorable to Africans, such as having multiple SIM card inputs, because we often struggle with network connectivity and prices. So a lot of Africans will initially have 2 to 3 different cheap phones, but now they can have one phone that has multiple SIM card inputs, as well as introducing different African languages in terms of the keyboard. So there are a lot of material and very specific to African people's context that China has been able to offer in the last 2 decades that has gone basically uncomparable to other foreign relations, whether it be the US, whether it be Russia, whether it be Europe itself. And so, right now we have seen a very clear leap and advancement in terms of how Africa is able to initiate its own self-development. And I think we're seeing more and more improved public relations, not only among state to state, but African people starting to see what China has to offer, especially since, was it December of 2020, with the China being able to achieve 800 million people, being taken out of extreme poverty. And that's massive for a country that looks demographically or population-wise similar to the African continent.
Mm-hmm. And also, I want to ask your opinion on this recent the U.S. Africa Leaders Summit, because just I think on December the 13th to 15th, 49 African leaders were invited to Washington D.C. for this U.S. Africa Leaders Summit. And I'm reading through the documents on the U.S. government website because I'm trying to figure out the language they use, and because they said they recognize that Africa is a key geopolitical player, so they are looking for deeper connections, cooperation with African nations, looking for mutual respects. So I'm just wondering, how is this summit perceived by African people?
I think there are a number of elements that we can touch on that speak to a couple of the issues that I think a lot of politicians, experts, anyone who follows these kinds of international relations would have found or would agree around. Is one is, they speak about how they've pledging 55 billion, and it seems like a big figure. It seems like, wow, this is a lot of money. But what we're not seeing is a lot of detail around where that money will go to, how it will be dispersed. And I know that one of the criticisms that has been made by various China-Africa institutes has been around the fact that it doesn't seem like the plan is very specific, very goal-oriented, or very clear on what we call deliverables. And so that already is a red flag, because many people, especially those of us who are like critics of capitalism, see these funds as largely earmarked for private firms. So basically it will form a role of subsidizing US multinationals in the African continent and the projects that they're doing, but not necessarily channeling it directly to clear, concrete projects. That's one. Two is the fact that, all right, Africans have to be able to, and this is largely thanks to our growing relationship with China, is because of the rise of China and the US clearly scrambling to, configure its position in the African continent. It seems like a desperate one. It said, we're not dictating Africa's relationships, but every single coverage from Al Jazeera to the Voice of America have said, this is a summit to recapture or, regain the attentions of African leaders in the face of rising China collaboration and trade. So one, though, is that the rise of China has enabled us to push and leverage certain issues that have been put on the back burner, such as the fact that, yes, we'll accept the win, the small minor victory of the fact that the US came out and Biden came out supporting the African Union's bid for a membership on the G20. The European Union has a membership on the G20. Africa also wants to be a full member, as well as since 2005, Africa, since the Ezulwini consensus, has been, basically bidding for permanent seat on the United Nations Security Council. Keep in mind that African states in the United Nations, they represent about 28% of membership of the United Nations, and therefore are almost a third, yet they have no permanent security, position in the Security Council. And so now the Biden administration has said that they do support it. But of course, this is coming, decades too late. And I mean, even China in August, during the follow-up of the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation Forum, they had a follow-up meeting in August, basically to check that everything is going as was proposed. And then they already said that we should be having the G21 and endorsed Africa way before. So it almost seems like the US is scrambling to catch up on this. And the last thing I'll mention about the summit that I think, or the two last things I'll mention about the summit, is that one, we also have seen, and this has been coming from former government officials and diplomats, such as, I think it was on Al Jazeera, there was a former African Union diplomat, I think she's from Zimbabwe. She was very outspoken about the fact that African leaders were not consulted prior to the US-Africa Leaders Summit about what the agenda would be, what some of the outcomes should be. So there is this underlying, even though you'll see African heads of state smiling and nodding and taking photos and whatnot, there is on the sidelines, I think, this perception that Africa is still treated as a junior partner in the international political landscape, and that they are still consistently spoken to and treated in a very paternalistic and patronizing way. And there's this US superiority complex that they simply don't deserve, as Africa is this massive continent with so much economic potential, political potential. And we've seen now with the Ukraine war, the kind of role that Africa can play politically in terms of pushing its weight behind certain UN resolutions or not pushing its weight behind them. So it seems that also this summit was characterized by this continued superiority complex that African leaders and African people are just not buying anymore. And lastly is that in terms of the kind of pledges they made, they made pledges, even though Joe Biden, patronizingly told, I think it was 5 or 6 African countries who are going to have elections next year, make sure that you have free and fair and transparent elections, and pledge, some millions towards, governance and electoral transparency. But what we didn't see is the US responding to some of the very urgent crises, such as, for example, just one of them is the debt crisis that's been happening on the African continent. There are at least 7 African countries who are considered in debt distress, and at least 16 who are at risk. And yet there was no significant engagement, despite the fact that most debt held by African states is owed to the wealthy bondholders in Western states, right? These are kind of debts that were brokered by the IMF, by the World Bank. And we've seen many, many studies despite, and I'm glad your guests already mentioned it in different ways, so I don't have to go into detail, despite the fact that China is accused of creating this debt trap diplomacy. But China only actually holds about 8% of sub-Saharan Africa's total public debt. And within the foreign issuers or external actors, it's about 18% of the external actors. So China is still actually proportionally small in terms of the debt African countries and nations owe in terms of their public debts. And yet, even though the West holds most of it, the US leads a lot of these institutions, there was no mention in this summit of addressing the debt crisis, which that would have been, I think, something that they could have done even just off the tip of my nose, take a small little chunk, do a little bit of debt forgiveness. I mean, China earlier, they forgave about, was it 20 something countries? They forgave their debt in August, which amounted to a couple of significant billions. And so I think that this is also part of what Africans want to see from the US, but are not seeing. So there's this lack of sincerity behind what the US is actually saying. And I'll wait until, I'm told otherwise, but we want to see material differences. We want to see material results of these so-called, promises and proposals from the US.
Even though on the official government documents, they never mentioned China or trying to say they are trying to compete with China through this summit. But I think all the, like you mentioned earlier, basically all the major media are interpreting this move as the US latest desperate move trying to compete the influence with China in the African continents. And, but like you said, it's very interesting that they didn't do the concrete things. And I think it's also interesting to see their wordings, because now on their documents, they're saying where the United States and African nations have shared priorities, we have shared interests, we will work with mutual respect. All these wordings are similar, like what China, that's the reason why many developing countries are willing to work with China, because China was not interfering their domestic issues and also show mutual respects. But now the United States and some Western governments never showed this mutual respect to countries in the global south. And now they're certainly changing their wording, their documents. I just think it's very hilarious. Do you think the United States has any chance to compete with the influence from Chinese companies in African continent?
I mean, at this stage, I think there are three things we should consider. Is one, that in the last 20 years where China has been building its economic relationship and political relationship with the African continent, where we've seen, for example, even as perhaps we can consider it superficial, but I think it's still very integral, the fact that since the 2014 first US-Africa summit, that was in 2014, we've seen an 8-year gap in terms of a serious diplomatic engagement with Africa. Whilst China, on the other hand, in the same space of time, has had at least, I think it's about 8 forum on China-Africa or Africa-China cooperation forums or meetings. So we've seen this high level of diplomatic engagement where I think since between 2009 and 2018, there were about 222 trips between China and Africa in terms of diplomacy. And we've seen consistently, I think since the 90s, that Africa has been China's primary priority each year, coming to the African continent as its first diplomatic visit every single year in the beginning of the year. And that's important. That shows a prioritization that I think Africa historically has not experienced from Western, US, European so-called partners / former colonizers. Then the second part is, in the last 20 years, whilst China has been building these new relationships, economic, diplomatic, trade, political, etc., what has been a contrast is that the US has prioritized a military buildup. So we saw the formation of the US Africa Command in 2007. Now we have around 29 foreign US military permanent bases on the African continent, with at least 60 access points or outposts that they can access in, I think it's over 34 or so African countries. And so we see this prioritization of, military presence on the African continent that doesn't seem to reflect any of the kind of solutions to African problems or problems of the continent in terms of inequality of economic development. So there seems like this skewed priority. That's one. And two is that this skewed priority is clearly not based on trying to develop relationships with Africans autonomously, as you've mentioned, and I think this is important to understand then the US-Africa summit that just happened, is in August, we had Antony Blinken, the US Secretary of State, launching the new strategy document, the US strategy towards sub-Saharan Africa. And in it, they mention China and Russia combined at least 10 times. And they talk about them in terms of their near-peer rivalry, and there's very little mention of what does the African sovereignty project look like? What would it look like for us to independently engage the African continent to ensure that we can help them on their own terms, on our own terms, uplift the African continent? So we see this discrepancy around, you say that you want to talk to us on our own terms, you say we shouldn't choose, you say this is just about the US and Africa forming a stronger relationship, but clearly it's all premised on a kind of great power competition and geopolitical competition, a new Cold War essentially between the US and China and Russia and other people who basically contend with the US's historical hegemonic position on the international geopolitical stage. So for a lot of us, we see these recent moves as a slightly more subtle, but nonetheless clear maneuver of the US to counter China and other groups. And we saw this in April with there was this overwhelming passing of a bill in the US House of Representatives, the Counter Malign Russian Influence Activities in Africa Act. And, this basically would penalize African nations who worked with specific Russian corporations or multinationals. And again, this is clearly a subtle way of, again, maneuvering around the fact that that Africa is finding alternative partners that the US is not happy with. And if the US is not happy with it, then, we are not allowed to develop and advance the African continent independently. So this goes way back. All of these recent activities go way back in terms of the US's aim to and I keep doing this movement, but this capturing of the African state, because China is surpassing them in almost any field of cooperation. And we saw last year there was a 35% jump from the previous year in terms of the trade volume, with China being at, I think it's 254 billion is the total Africa-China trade volume, whilst the US is lagging behind around 64 billion or something like that.
And let's not forget the reports by, I think, the newspaper in Zimbabwe. Some reporters find out that the United States was sponsoring training local journalists to intentionally read bad reports on China's projects in Africa. So try and train separatist groups, certain groups, so-called independent journalists, to intentionally create some chaos in front of Chinese companies and also defame the BRI. So you saw some chaos in the certain countries. So where the money goes. So they promise to invest those money in African nations, but certain money goes to just not for development, not for infrastructure, but trying to badmouth another country. It's very worrying that when these Western countries, Western powers, when they go to this region, either Africa or Latin America, when they go to the developing world, they're not going there to help the local people. They're rather going there just to compete with another power. The intentions is different. So you go there not for mutual interest, not for mutual development, but rather just to keep another person, a third party out. That mindset is different. So, and sometimes it's not about what China wants, or it's not about what the United States wants. It's what the African nations want. It's about what kind of development African people want. And the different mindset, I think, will be perceived very differently by the African people about the roles of the Western powers. A lot of viewers are giving comments. This is let me read a few to you. This person is called Josh on YouTube. He said, "The U.S. is like a jealous ex. Once you move on to a new relationship, she wants you back." This is the viewer who is watching the live stream now giving this comment.
I totally agree.
Really?
Totally agree. I mean, it's like basically that you didn't look at my Instagram for a while, and now you see I'm in a new relationship, and now you're freaking out and you're trying to double back and say, so I totally agree with that comment.
And very, very clear. I got more comments, but I also prepared this section for you. This funny takes on Africa. So you have 10 seconds to give a comment to each of this take. So are you ready?
Yes.
Okay, let's take a look at the first one. Kamala Harris, the Vice President of the United States.
So true in terms of not what we can do for Africa, but with Africa. So Africa is always going to be like an arm of the body of the US in terms of what the US can achieve. And as long as it's expedient and within the interests of the US, then Africa is of interest. And we saw this with the way they were pushing for African leaders to vote against or to condemn Russia and Ukraine, as well as to sanction the Ukraine. But prior to that, they're not coming to Africa to talk to us about our various security issues, the various civil wars we are having in our continent, condemning some of the acts that are happening on the African continent, go completely hidden all the time. So this is definitely the double standard of the US of, we're with you only when it's at our own interests and in our own time, not on your own terms.
Right. Let's take a look at the next one. So I don't know whether you know the story about this. They're putting all African leaders into a bus to the Queen's funeral. So what's your comment on this?
I mean, I think this is also, regardless of the role that the West and the US has taken, our own African leaders continue to perpetuate and buy into, like, why did they go at all? They should just have not gone at all and said, we are people from former colonies that have come as a result of this empire that the Queen has led. And so why should we participate in bending the knee at her funeral to start off with? I'm sorry, that's my personal anti-imperialist Pan-Africanist perspective.
Thank you. I like your rant. Okay, let's take a look at the next one. That's what we discussed. So their narrative is China is buying the whole African continent. So what's your comment?
I mean, I think it's ridiculous, and it's just not factually correct, because a lot of the land and primary resources continue to be held by former colonial powers and companies that basically benefited from 200, 300 years of conquest, of subjugation. So I think images like this are just not factual, because if we actually, I think, A, put it correct in terms of where China exists, B, put it in contrast to US and European countries' financial investments and ownership of land, we'd see a totally different picture that was completely disproportionate to what you're seeing right now.
Very good answer. Thank you. And do we have another picture? I think we do. Let's take a look at the next one. These countries aren't poor. These countries are rich. Only the people are poor. They are not underdeveloped. They are overexploited by the famous historian Michael Parenti. So what's your thought on this, Mika?
No, 100% is I know it sounds, and honestly, like in Africa, a lot of people think it's very dull to talk about colonialism and imperialism. But the fact of the matter is, how can we say we've recovered from, again, centuries of purposeful underdevelopment, purposeful extraction of not only the material resources, but the human resources through the slave trade that basically enriched the West, enriched Europe, enriched America, as well as it happened in Latin America, as you can see in Latin and Central America. So we don't have a lack of resources. We have cobalt, coltan, we have the most mineral resources of all the continents. We have the human capacity, but none of that is actually being able to serve the people. And I think that's what the US wants to continue with its recent developments. And I mean, I didn't get time to talk about this, but they quickly snuck in on a deal between Zambia and Congo, who were basically creating their own independent lithium battery manufacturing. And the US quickly snuck in during this US Africa Leader Summit to basically come in the middle of this and control the supply chain when Africa was going to do it independently. And we've seen this time and time again from the US, whilst China offers different models that don't interfere and don't dictate on how Africa should develop its own economies and its own future.
And I remember I watched this talk by African researcher. In the speech, in front of all this Western audience, she said, how come your currency worth much more than our currency when you basically stole and shipped all our gold to your country? This is absolutely ridiculous. So, and it's really, sometimes it really make me angry that they built their wealth by exploiting those regions. And they still don't even treat people from those regions as like basic human beings. Sometimes they demonize not just people in Africa, also people in Latin America and Asia. So it's something we need to work hard together to fight against. So very impressive discussion with you, Mika. I really enjoyed this. And I know my next guest has been waiting online for a really long time. So unfortunately, I have to.
Sorry.
Unfortunately, I have to say goodbye to you. But I'm looking forward to have you more on this show in 2023. Thank you so much, Mika.